Imagine you're the station master at a small depot in western Pennsylvania. It's 1853. You've got a timetable pinned to the wall. You've got a clock ticking behind you. You've got the rules memorized, and right now, according to everything in front of you, the 8:15 express is on time and the track ahead is clear. 12 miles east in the next town over, a conductor just looked at his clock. He ran the same calculation. He came to the exact same conclusion. They're both right, and they're both about to be catastrophically wrong. Because the clock on your wall reads 8:07, the clock in his town reads 8:19, and neither of you knows that those two clocks are measuring the same moment of the same morning. They're just reading different versions of reality. See, in 1853, the sun was the master of time. Every town in America set its clocks by the exact moment the sun crossed directly overhead. It was logical. It was ancient. It was perfectly local, and it worked until it had to be shared across a network moving at 60 miles an hour. Here's the thing about solar time that nobody ever had to think about before locomotives existed. The sun does not move at the same speed as a train. Every 12 miles you travel west, the sun falls another minute behind. Travel 120 miles, and the sun is 10 minutes off. Cross an entire continent, and you haven't just accumulated minutes, you've stitched together a patchwork quilt of irreconcilable realities. 12 minutes. That was the gap between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Small enough to ignore, large enough to kill. But here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. The solution didn't come from scientists. It didn't come from governments. It came from a handful of private businessmen who decided, with zero legal authority, to reprogram how the entire planet measures reality. And the world just let them. Now, to understand why time had to be invented, you have to understand something counterintuitive first, why it never needed to be. For most of human history, time was a local thing. The sun rose, it climbed to its highest point, it set, and people in whatever village they lived in set their clocks by that highest point called solar noon, the moment when shadows were shortest and the sun stood straight above. And this wasn't sloppy. This was actually the definition of precision. Sundials were accurate, church bells rang on schedule, market days started when they were supposed to. The system worked because nobody traveled fast enough for the cracks to show. If the clock in the next town was 3 minutes off from yours, who cared? You weren't going to get there in 3 minutes anyway. Boston ran 12 minutes ahead of New York. Philadelphia was 5 minutes behind. Chicago was 11 minutes behind Cincinnati. And these weren't errors, they were published facts, printed in almanacs, treated like geographical features, same as the elevation of a mountain. Permanent, natural, unquestioned. The problem is, nobody had ever needed to agree on what time it was until the day they suddenly, desperately did. That day came with the locomotive. The first commercial railways in Britain opened in the 1830s. By 1840, there were nearly 1,400 miles of track. By 1850, that number had more than doubled. And every single mile of new rail was being laid across a landscape where the next town's clock might disagree with yours by anywhere from 1 minute to 20. At first, it was manageable. Trains were slow, lines were short, a 3-minute gap between London and Oxford. You just built slack into the timetable, annoying but survivable. Then trains got faster, lines got longer, and the stakes changed completely. By the late 1840s, the Great Western Railway in England was running express services at 50, sometimes 60 miles per hour. The Pennsylvania Railroad was threading routes across a state where the eastern edge and the western edge were separated by 20 minutes of solar time. And right here is where the problem stopped being a scheduling nuisance and became something genuinely dangerous. A single-track railway line, and that was the kind that dominated the entire 19th century, requires 2 trains going in opposite directions to share the same rail. The only way that works is scheduling. One train pulls into a siding, waits, lets the other pass. That schedule is only valid if both trains agree on what time it is. If they don't, the schedule is fiction, and the consequences of running fiction at 60 miles an hour are not abstract. The railroads saw the problem coming. What they didn't grasp, not immediately, was that they couldn't solve it from inside the system they already had. The first attempt was the obvious one: railroad time. In 1840, the Great Western Railway in England made a unilateral decision. From now on, every station on their network would operate on London time. Not local time, not solar time, London's clock. A single master signal, synchronized by telegraph, would govern the entire line. And honestly, it worked brilliantly. For one railway. Then passengers had to change trains, because the GWR ran on London time. But the London and Birmingham Railway ran on Birmingham time. The Midland Railway ran on Derby time, and a passenger transferring between them at an interchange station had to mentally juggle 3 different clocks, none of which matched the clock on the station wall, which still showed local solar. Time for the benefit of the townspeople outside. It wasn't chaos. It was something worse than chaos. It was organized contradiction. Now, in North America, the same problem was playing out, but at a scale that made England's version look manageable. The United States alone, by 1870, had over 80,000 miles of track. The country spanned roughly 3,000 miles east to west, a solar difference of about 4 hours. And the railroads weren't dealing with 2 or 3 incompatible time systems. They were dealing with more than 50. Every major railroad kept its own time standard, pegged to the solar time of wherever its headquarters happened to be. So a passenger who boarded a train in New York, bound for Chicago, would pass through New York time, then Erie time, then Pittsburgh time, then Columbus time, each zone its own separate reality, each shift requiring mental arithmetic, each mistake a potential catastrophe. And in the major hubs, the stations didn't even try to pretend there was one time. Some terminals had multiple clocks on the wall, one for each railroad that operated through the building. Travelers described standing in front of 3 different clocks, all showing different times, with absolutely no way to know which one governed their departure. This wasn't a technology problem. The telegraph had been around since the 1840s. Synchronizing clocks was mechanically straightforward. This was a coordination architecture problem. There was no authority, not a government, not a treaty, not a shared standard, with the power to force competing private railroads to throw away their own time and submit to someone else's. Let that land for a second. The most powerful transportation network on the face of the earth was being operated by men carrying multiple pocket watches, each set to a mutually exclusive version of reality, and nobody in any government building anywhere on the continent thought this was their problem to solve. The system was broken. Everyone could see it. The death toll was real. The financial losses were documented. And yet, for 15 years, nothing changed. The question isn't why the system failed. The question is why it took so long to fix. The breaks came in steel and wreckage. The collision at Revere, Massachusetts, August 1871. A telegraph operator's clock error put a passenger express onto a section of track already scheduled for another train. 29 people killed. When investigators dug into the cause, they found the root of it in a scheduling discrepancy measured in minutes, not hours, minutes. The Angola horror of 1867, one of the deadliest rail disasters in American history at that point. Timing coordination failures across multiple junctions. 69 people dead when 2 cars detached from the train and plunged off a bridge into a frozen creek bed below. These were not freak accidents. They were not acts of God. They were the entirely predictable output of a system that asked human beings to mentally convert between multiple incompatible time standards in real time, under operational pressure, while trains were moving at speeds that compressed the margin for error down to almost nothing. The railroads had a name for it. They called their scheduling conflicts time wars, and the conductors on the front lines of those wars carried multiple watches. One calibrated to this railroad's standard, another to that one, trying to hold competing versions of reality in their heads all at once. One wrong conversion, one misread about which watch applied to which section of track, and a 60-mile-per-hour train became an unguided projectile. By the early 1880s, the structural failure of the American railway timekeeping system had become impossible to ignore. Every major railroad was bleeding money on delays, reroutings, and the legal liability from accident after accident. Passengers had lost confidence. Freight shippers were calculating their losses from missed connections and publishing them. Insurance underwriters were raising premiums across the board. And here's what makes this moment extraordinary in the history of infrastructure. The fix didn't come from a government. In Europe, national railways had the backing of sovereign authority. Britain's parliament could legislate time. The German Empire could command its railways to fall in line. But in the United States of the 1880s, there was no federal railway authority. And frankly, there was no appetite for one. So the solution would have to come from the industry itself, from the private companies whose survival now depended on solving a problem that none of them could solve alone. In October 1883, Charles Ferdinand Dowd, a Connecticut schoolmaster who had spent 15 years lobbying railroad executives with a single idea, and William Frederick Allen, the managing editor of The Official Guide of the Railways, brought their proposal to a general conference of railway superintendents in Chicago. The proposal was simple. Divide the continent into 4 bands. Each band, 1 hour. The switch, November 18, 1883, noon. On November 18, 1883, at exactly noon, telegraph operators across North America transmitted a single synchronized signal. Station clocks across the continent stopped. Then they were reset. In cities that had been running ahead of their new zone time, the hands jumped backward. In cities that had been behind, they jumped forward. Chicago literally experienced the same minute twice. Buffalo's clocks moved back 18 minutes all at once. In New York City, Western Union synchronized every major clock in the city to a single standard derived from Greenwich. There was no federal law behind it, no congressional mandate, no presidential order. An industry had simply decided to rebuild the rules of reality, and it worked. Newspapers called it the Day of Two Noons. But not everyone went along quietly. In Detroit, the city government flat out refused to reset its clocks, running on its own local time for years, while every railroad passing through operated on the new standard. In Georgia, newspapers branded it a Yankee conspiracy. Several southern cities treated the whole thing as yet another imposition from northern industrial capital, and honestly, depending on how you look at it, that's exactly what it was. The railroads didn't negotiate. They didn't hold referendums. They didn't ask for local approval. They set the standard, ran their trains on it, and left every holdout city to do the math themselves. Within 5 years, the holdouts had surrendered. The network was too large, too useful, and too economically essential to fight, and the effect on the ground was immediate. For the first time in the history of North American rail, a conductor could look at one watch and know, without converting, without calculating, without second-guessing, whether the track ahead was safe. One watch, one reality. The coordination nightmare that had killed dozens, delayed thousands, and cost millions just stopped. The following year, 1884, the international community convened the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. 25 nations agreed on a global framework of 24 time zones anchored to the Greenwich Meridian. Think about that. The infrastructure of modern time, the system you use every single day, was not designed by astronomers. It was not commissioned by governments. It was not born from some philosophical consensus about how civilization should measure reality. It was reverse-engineered from a train collision problem. The zones you check when you schedule a video call, catch a flight, or glance at a timestamp. Those are the direct descendants of the scheduling logic that a room full of railway superintendents in Chicago agreed to in 1883, because the alternative was watching their networks destroy themselves 12 minutes at a time. There's a principle buried in this story that goes well beyond trains. Every time a network grows faster than its coordination standard, the network starts to fail. Not because the parts are bad, not because the people running it are incompetent, but because coordination itself is a technology, and like any technology, it can become obsolete. The railway executives of the 1870s weren't fools. They'd built the most sophisticated transportation infrastructure in human history. They had conquered geography, reduced weeks of travel to days. But they had inherited a timekeeping system designed for a world where the fastest thing moving across the landscape was a horse. And when you run a horse-era system inside a locomotive-era reality, the horse-era system kills people. We keep seeing this pattern over and over. The Internet, in its early decades, ran on protocol standards designed for a network connecting a few dozen academic computers, not billions of devices. The coordination failures that followed weren't technical failures, they were architectural ones. The system had been designed for a completely different speed. Financial markets in the 2000s developed high-frequency trading capabilities that outran the regulatory frameworks built for human-speed transactions. The coordination lag produced flash crashes, moments where the market's own logic generated outcomes that no human had ordered and no human could stop in time. Air traffic control systems in many countries still run on coordination protocols from the 1960s, managing physical and digital infrastructure that has since multiplied in complexity by orders of magnitude. And here's the uncomfortable version of this story. Right now, you are inside several of these systems simultaneously. Your financial data moves at speeds your legal system cannot track. Your attention is being auctioned in milliseconds by algorithms operating outside any coordination framework that existed when you were born. The clock mismatch isn't between Pittsburgh and Cleveland anymore. It's between the speed of your infrastructure and the speed of your ability to govern it. The pattern is always the same. A system works until it hits a new speed, and then the coordination layer is always what breaks first. What makes the 1883 solution remarkable isn't that they fixed the problem. It's that they fixed it without waiting for the world to tell them they could. Private industry, facing existential failure, built a new version of reality and simply implemented it. Time zones are not a natural feature of the universe. They are an engineering decision. The question is always the same: who makes the decision and how long do we wait before we have to? In the winter of 1883, a schoolmaster from Connecticut and a railway schedule editor changed the way every human being on Earth experiences every single day of their life. Not with a law, not with a war, not with a breakthrough that overturned physics. With a grid, 12 minutes, the gap between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. It was small enough to be ignored for decades, but it was large enough that when two locomotives were hurtling toward each other at a combined speed of over 100 miles per hour, 12 minutes was the difference between a clear track and an iron wall. The people who built the standard time system didn't think of themselves as philosophers of time. They were logistics engineers. They were staring at spreadsheets full of scheduling conflicts and liability claims, trying to figure out why their network kept tearing itself apart. And the answer turned out to be that the network had outgrown its foundational assumption that time was local. The railway executives of 1883 didn't ask for permission to rewrite the rules of time. They simply did it because they had to, because nobody else would. And because the cost of inaction was measured in steel, in wreckage, and in lives, time is not local, time is infrastructure. And like every infrastructure system, road networks, sewage grids, electrical standards, it works invisibly when it works, and catastrophically when it doesn't. The next time you glance at a clock and it tells you exactly what time it is, in perfect agreement with every other clock in your zone, remember, that agreement is not natural. It is not obvious. And it was never inevitable. It was engineered. It was contested. It was imposed by an industry that had run out of alternatives. And 12 minutes made it necessary. If you're fascinated by the invisible systems that hold civilization together, the ones nobody thinks about until they break, this channel is where we take them apart. Subscribe, and we'll keep going deeper.